I've only ever worked in Lancashire, so I think I know the Lancashire folk. It has a real mix, the diverse communities we have. It's a great place to work and live. Always wanted to join the police. I've been in our force major investigation team since 2019, and it's took a number of years to get the correct skill, requirements to join the department. You have to be on top of your game, really, to try and get this role. On the night of the 19th of November 2019, police received numerous phone calls from members of the public reporting that somebody had been knocked down on King Street in Blackburn. We responded to that, thinking at that time, worst case, a hit and run. We had two people, unfortunately, laid on the floor, a male and a female, and the offending vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Then phone calls were made to our senior investigating officers to come and take command of that scene.
Veteran officer D.I. Lee Wilson was drafted in to take charge.
I very rarely worked over this side of the county. I tend to ply my trade over at the west side of the county. And I got the call from my superintendent, briefing, 9:30 tomorrow morning. Can you get yourself over and take charge of the investigation? I'm termed an SIO. Under me, I will have Detective Inspector, Detective Sergeants, and then we have a blend, really, of various disciplines. Two of the key players on this investigation were DS Mark Brennan, who was the allocator receiver. That's an absolutely key role.
My role is running the inquiry team. You understand the direction the boss wants to go in, and you're giving that out to the proper workers, often in the investigation, and they're feeding back to you, their inquiries that they're doing.
DC Lisa Bennett was the lead flow. Lisa will flag up the family's concerns, almost champion the family's corner within the investigation.
You're there as the point of contact between the investigation team and the family, feeding the family updates and also trying to extract as much information as you can from the family about the victim to try and find out why it's happened.
With a team in place, they launched Operation Woodford to investigate the crime.
There appeared to be something more than a, dare I say it, routine road traffic accident. This was not a vehicle with a blown tyre, a vehicle with defective steering. Watching that video on that first morning, this is clearly more sinister. This looks like a targeted attack.
The female victim, single mum Alison McBlain, had suffered horrific injuries and was in a critical condition. Family Liaison Officer DC Lisa Bennett was called in.
I was asked to go to Royal Blackburn Hospital to speak to the family of the victim. I remember getting to the hospital and speaking with the mother of the victim. I remember myself sitting them down and explaining that we were treating it as a criminal investigation, that it wasn't an accident. The mother of the victim wasn't really listening to what I was saying to her. All she cared about was her daughter going to survive? Was she going to pull through?
They started to build a picture of the 36-year-old victim and those who depended on her.
The victim had a young son who was 12. At that point, he didn't know what had happened to his mum. There's no easy deployment at all, but when it involves children, it's tough.
Speaking to a number of eyewitnesses, people collectively were saying that they heard a noise, a vehicle driving, accelerating, with screeching sounds, but very few actually saw the actual impact itself.
Although there were few eyewitnesses, the impact was caught on CCTV.
From the review of the council CCTV, we could see the vehicle mounts the curb, gives a no quarter, hits the female. She's up into the air, off the bonnet, off the windscreen, and it's thrown about 30, 40 feet. He collapses in a heap, and then you can see him get up. He's looking around himself, clearly looking for his partner.
She sustained over 20 injuries to her body.
The injuries to the female victim were extremely serious, described as catastrophic.
The male sustained injuries mainly to his hands and his feet.
You can see pedestrians are, what on earth has just happened? And they step towards the male. He sees his partner's coat on the pavement. Obviously his mind is in shock, he's trying to process what's just happened, and he walks towards the coat and realises she's actually there on the floor, still inside the coat, in a terrible state. and he says to a member of the public, look after her, I can't hang around, and he disappears into the night.
With the male victim long gone, the team focused on finding the car, a silver Fiat Punto.
It was fast moving to begin with. Any officers that can be spared are brought to major investigations like this, whether it be uniformed colleagues, CID, whatever it may be. Every available resource is involved in that initial phase because the priority is to get that vehicle.
And the team effort paid off.
The vehicle was recovered fairly quickly after the attack, down an alley about a mile or so away by a traffic officer who noticed this vehicle, and in fact it was smouldering, the contents were smouldering. He had the presence of mind to extinguish the fire. We could see the accident damage to the front of the vehicle. That looked wholly consistent with the collision, and also that one of the tyres had blown out, which you could see on the CCTV with the sparks as the steel came into contact with the roadway. So pretty happy that we had the right car. What is in there that might lead me to identify who the offenders are?
When we ran the registration through the police national computer, it came back registered to an identical make of vehicle, but it lived in a different county than Lancashire. Obviously we conducted inquiries with themselves, but it was clear that person had nothing to do with it, and the vehicle was running on a cloned plate.
Basically, somebody had had possession of that vehicle and decided to mask its identity. And there'd been a concerted attempt to set fire to the car and, no doubt to my mind, to destroy evidence. So that makes me think straight away there's some sort of criminal element here, some element of pre-planning. Somebody's thought around this. How do we try and cover our tracks?
With the car badly damaged, they were not sure what evidence, if any, could be recovered. And there was more bad news from the hospital, where the young mum's condition was deteriorating.
At that point, the victim was lying critical. She was on life support. I spoke to the doctor, the consultant, who basically told us that they didn't think she was going to pull through. And the next day, they would be doing brain stem tests to verify if there were any signs of life.
Lancashire police had received reports of a serious hit and run with 2 people injured. But it quickly became apparent this was no tragic accident.
This was not a vehicle with a blown tyre, a vehicle with defective steering. This looks like a targeted attack.
One of the victims who had been hit had quickly fled the scene, but the other, Alison mcblain, a mum of 1, was taken to hospital in a coma.
The injuries to the female victim were extremely serious, described as catastrophic by the doctors in charge of her care.
24 hours in, and the main lead was the car that had been involved in the hit and run. The police hoped it could give clues to the offenders, but it had been deliberately set on fire.
This was a whodunit. Who was driving? Who else was in that vehicle? Who's had that vehicle prior to the attack? What is in there that might lead me to identify who the offenders are? There was very little on police systems around that car being used in Blackburn prior to the attack, so we really didn't have anything to put somebody in the driver's seat. There he is. Inside the vehicle was covered in soot. All the soft furnishings, the door linings, they were all melted.
It was a really concerted attempt to try and destroy evidence within that vehicle. But there was forensic opportunities for us in the lower parts.
In the footwells of the vehicle, we recovered a bag of sweets, M&Ms if memory serves, a cigarette butt,
and a receipt for a local shop of an item that was purchased earlier that afternoon. Thankfully, had not set on fire itself, so our inquiries then were immediately turned to going to that shop and reviewing the CCTV.
And news came from the hospital about the hit and run victim.
And it all seemed to happen very quickly, that they told the family, unfortunately, there was nothing more they could do. They just turned the machine off and then she's gone. It is difficult.
With the death of Alison, the team were now investigating a murder.
We had to start to learn, start to speak with the family about our victims' lives. Why has this happened?
Family Liaison Officer Lisa Bennett started to talk to Alison's mum, Sharon.
We started asking about the victim's lifestyle to see if there was anything there. She'd had somewhat of a troubled life and she had turned to drugs. But recently, she thought that she'd turned a corner and she'd managed to get herself clean of these drugs.
However, a new man on the scene seemed to have set Alison back.
She got involved with a male who was a boyfriend. The mother of the victim told us she didn't like him. She thought that he led the victim astray.
CCTV from a local fast food shop confirmed that the second victim that fateful night was indeed her new boyfriend.
He's the one person, to my mind, who can tell us who's most likely in that car. And I couldn't get to him because I couldn't find him. And I had to devote a lot of resources to getting hold of him. But eventually he came good. He's not the type of person who would want to speak to police officers readily, normally, but he did.
He was quite open with us, admitted to being himself a drug user. He gave us the background and the reasons to why they were targeted. The evening prior to the murder taking place, he had stolen some drugs off another individual. We then started to paint a picture that it was those individuals we were interested in.
So our two victims have been responsible for placing an order for drugs via this bully line, as it was called, this organised crime group, to purchase drugs. And instead of purchasing the drugs, they taxed, as they call it in drug parlance. They basically stole drugs from the occupants of that vehicle.
It was approximately £60 worth of drugs. I think it's a fair assumption to make that if you tax or rob, steal from a drugs line, then there's going to be some sort of repercussions.
The police still had no names, so they continued to try and build a picture of the events after the hit and run.
This murder took place on King Street, so initially we do a survey of King Street. This is relatively town centre as well. You then start identifying the vehicle and its direction of travel, and you keep growing that CCTV survey, keeping control of that vehicle, moving on to its next street, the next location, and wherever that may be.
The suspects had dumped the car in an area not covered by CCTV. But luckily there were cameras just along the road which captured them fleeing.
We'd had relatively grainy figures on CCTV, people leaving the dump site. They all went off in different directions, and it's then seeing where they go. We didn't know who the 4 occupants of the vehicle were at that time, but what we did know is that within half an hour or thereabouts of the murder taking place, the 4 people that were in that vehicle were all back in one address.
Which was about, I think, quarter of a mile, half a mile from where the car was dumped. It wasn't immediately set fire to. What appears to have happened is that the individuals had gone back towards this home, and then they came back, or rather 2 were sent back to set fire to the vehicle. So no doubt there had been a council of war, a gathering of the clan, or the group, or the gang, or whatever you want to call them, and they'd decided what to do next.
As well as a growing understanding of what had happened, the house in question at last gave the police the identity of one of the suspects, a small-scale drug gang boss who seemed to be at the centre of everything.
When we had these 4 individuals going back to this address and we arrested the male occupant, we would say that he's the head of this organised crime group who was given that instruction to go and do this revenge attack, because ultimately it was his drugs that were stolen. We then started painting a picture of all his associates. We've got a team doing these CCTV surveys of all the area, and we started to identify the occupants of that vehicle.
Their best lead proved to be the surviving evidence from the burnt-out car.
The main thing that we got from that was, there's a receipt here from a transaction at a local store 2 or 3 hours before the murder. Go to the shop, see if they've got CCTV, time the transaction, and with a bit of luck, we'll get clips of people around the vehicle.
We were confident on who the driver was because many witnesses said he's been the driver of that vehicle for some period of time. He was wearing distinctive clothing. He's wearing the same clothing earlier in the afternoon as he is in the evening. His forensics within the vehicle as well. The front seat passenger was an easy one for us to identify because only a week or so before he'd injured his foot and was on crutches. You know, when we have somebody running on CCTV on crutches, that was quite a good indicator that he's our man.
We're looking around the hospitals, and sure enough, we start to pick this individual up.
In relation to the back seat passengers, that proved a bit more difficult.
But I went internally to departments within the police, departments who work with social services closely. Do you know these two young people? And we got lucky. One of them was correctly identified.
The fourth one was our trickiest customer in relation to trying to identify who that final passenger was. We had several images of this individual on CCTV, but couldn't really identify exactly who he was, but he was consistent with a male that we had as a suspect. And then when we had the bottles of juice that was bought from the shop, and we recovered them back from the head of the organised crime group's address, when that person's DNA came back on that bottle, Mr. Wilson, the senior investigating officer, was elated.
I want them all arresting. I want them all questioning. They tried to get out of town, but they couldn't get out of town. They hadn't got the money to get out of town and live on the run. And eventually, they just fell. It just fell into place, and they were arrested or surrendered.
5 men were now in custody, but one mystery remained. How had the killers known where to target Alison? Out of the blue, the family liaison officer took an anonymous call from a woman who claimed to have information.
I got a phone call on my police mobile. It was a withheld number and it was a female voice. Sounded younger, telling me that she had been with the victim moments before this had happened and that they'd had a conversation. I asked her for a name, she wasn't willing to give it to me. So I spoke to the mother of the victim and told her how important, how crucial this witness was. If she could try and persuade her to come forward, then it would really, really help. So she had a conversation with her and she gave her permission to give her name to me. The female was a friend who became a suspect.
The witness was another drug user and a friend of Alison.
We decided that we would have a look at what had happened in the immediate moments really before the attack. And what we knew was from the surviving victim that they'd split up briefly and that the female had gone into a local pharmacy just at the back of a garage forecourt, and she'd gone there ostensibly to pick up a methadone prescription. She was in there, we had the CCTV of that, she was wearing the same distinctive yellow coat. As she comes out of that premises, she, I suppose metaphorically and literally, bumps into somebody who she clearly knows.
By looking at the CCTV camera, you would believe that they're friends. The female victim then left the chemist and walked on King Street.
That female goes into the same pharmacy as our victim and instantly, and I mean instantly, is straight on her phone. Who's she ringing? Highly suspicious. Highly, highly suspicious. She keeps the door propped open and she's almost, we think, commentating. She appears to be studying where our victim's going.
What you're viewing there is her contacting the Buller line to give away the location of a friend.
She'd actually rung the people in the car. And we knew from other phone work that that group had put out to the drug-using community, if you tell us where they can be found, then we will sort you out and give you drugs or give you cash. And she literally put the black spot on her friend. She was at the funeral, clearly grief-stricken, and all the while she knew exactly what she'd done. She
knew that the victim was dead, partially because of her. But when it comes to drugs, you know, some of them would sell their own granny.
The reason her friend was dead was because she put that phone call in. We were able to pull that evidence together. She was arrested, she was brought in, and she was charged actually jointly with the murder.
At the Crown Court, the driver of the car was found guilty of murder and received 14 years. The front seat passenger was also found guilty of murder and was sentenced to 20 years. Another passenger received 17 and a half years. The 16-year-old was found not guilty. For ordering the hit and run, the gang boss received 14 years for manslaughter. Finally, Alison's friend was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to 13 years.
When I heard the verdict and we'd got back in a room with the family, we all shed a tear. We'd got justice.
But how do you ever replace a loved one? You know, how does a son ever replace his mother?
Every case brings its own challenges, and there can be no better purpose than to bring the offenders responsible for taking another person's life to justice.
Coming up, a Manchester drug-dealing family making millions run by a 42-year-old matriarch. From March 2020 to 2021, there were over 200,000 drug offences recorded in England and Wales. That's a leap of almost 20% on the year before.